This guy should be the MVP of the league this year. But that doesn't mean that the other players don't have a case. So I'm going to talk about 4 other players that I think do have a legitimate case to win the MVP this year, and then explain why I think it should be this guy instead. Before I get to the individual cases, there's one thing I really want to point out. Everybody we're going to talk about today has had an MVP caliber season. They've had a season worthy of winning the most valuable player award. That doesn't mean that they're going to win it or that they should win it, but it does mean that they've had an incredible year. It's just like when we talk about all-stars and all-NBA players. There are guys that have had seasons worthy of making those teams that haven't made it. There are MVPs and all-NBAs in the past that if they replicated that exact season this year, they wouldn't have made either of those things. So I'm not disrespecting any of the other players in this video when I'm making a case against them as it relates directly to Jokic. It just shows how incredible this MVP race has been. And I feel like I have to start by talking about Joel Embiid. And I'm one of those people that believes that the NBA MVP is a narrative-based award, whether it should be or not. If you're talking about who's ultimately going to win it, I do think that narratives come into play. And for Embiid coming into the season, knowing that Ben Simmons was not going to be available, presumably for the entirety of the season, the year that he's had is even more impressive. Before you even get into his game and the dominance of what he does on the floor, which we'll talk about, knowing that the second best player on your team just straight up quit coming into the year and then having the season that Embiid has had adds to the narrative potential of his MVP this season. Also, by the way, he's been incredible. Him and Jokic are constantly going to have this really interesting comparison between their careers because they really brought back the traditional post big guy to the league, but in different ways. We'll talk about Jokic later, but Embiid is as physically dominant a player as we have in the entire league. There's nobody else that has the same combination of size and strength and skill and quickness the way that Embiid does. Even someone like Giannis, I think Embiid is more skilled, and it's just incredible what he does on a nightly basis. His statistics are out of control. There's a very clear case here for Joel Embiid, not to mention the fact that he is a defensive player of the year caliber defender when he wants to and when he's engaged, and he's really carried this Sixers team. Not that the rest of the roster is bad, but to just not have Simmons there all year long, and now they have hard to replace him. It's incredible what he's done individually and for the team. And speaking of Giannis, he's been incredible as well, despite the fact that I think a lot of people, myself included, expected more out of Milwaukee in the regular season this year. They haven't been the same level of dominant as we've expected in the past, whether it be in terms of their record or their net rating and things like that. Giannis has still been incredible. I mean, individually, statistically, there's almost no match for him across the entire league in terms of what he does production-wise, especially like per minute or per 36. I hate per 36, but if you look at, the production that Giannis has when he's on the floor in what's relatively limited minutes compared to some other guys around the league, it's incredible how he's able to produce, what he means to that team, the emotion, the energy that he brings to the game. He's having an MVP caliber season. And then there's Ja, who I think if you want to make a case for Ja, it kind of starts with what was the story of this season. If you want the MVP to just tell the story of each individual season, talk about what was the biggest and the coolest thing that happened this year as it relates directly to contention and one of the best players in the league, I think it kind of has to be Ja if that's the base of your argument. It reminds me of when Derrick Rose won his MVP, and there were maybe other candidates that should have won it. Maybe LeBron should have won it. Maybe D Wade should have won it. But that season was kind of about those Chicago teams and how incredible they were and just the way that he embodied it and brought a new identity to this group. I think Morant's similar in that way, but in a completely different situation because Chicago has this history of success. They have Michael Jordan. They're a huge franchise. They're a huge fan base. And Memphis has been good in parts of the last decade, but it's just different. And he embodies this team in such an amazing way. And I think from a narrative perspective, not even to mention the fact that he's had an incredible year on the court. He's grown more than any other player in the league this year. He probably means more like almost spiritually and emotionally to Memphis than any other player in the league almost. And then I don't think you can make an MVP video without talking about DeMar Derozan and his individual scoring instincts. It's borderline unstoppable what he does in the mid-range. He can attack the rim with players falling all around him, with Zach LaVine missing some time, Lonzo missing some time, Caruso missing some time, Patrick Williams missing the entire year basically. They've been missing a key piece to their team, a team that didn't have a ton of depth to start with for the entirety of the season, and they're going to have one of the better records in the Eastern Conference. And I think DeMar Derozan deserves a ton of credit for that, in addition to obviously how incredible he's been individually, statistically, as an unstoppable mid-range scorer. And there's ways to kind of go deeper into the individual case for each of these guys, but I want to talk about Jokic now in comparison to all those, because all that sounds fantastic, right? It sounds like every one of those guys should win the MVP or that they have a legitimate case. And I honestly don't think that it's particularly close, because if you look at every single case that I just made, you can make that case for Jokic and then some. If you want to talk about the narrative aspect of it, the fact that he's had a skeleton crew of a team for basically the entire season. No MPJ, no Jamal Murray, Aaron Gordon's out there, but it's like Aaron Gordon and some guys that can occasionally make jump shots. That's pretty much it that's out there with Jokic. There's a narrative going around that it kind of seems like Denver is just treading water and they're barely, holding on to a 500 record. They're significantly above 500. They're within a few games record-wise of teams like Milwaukee and teams like Philadelphia, and it doesn't feel like that's the case when people are making an argument against Jokic. Individually, statistically, you don't even really have to talk about it. The numbers are out of control. They're amazing. There's almost no way you could expect him to be any better statistically. But here's the differentiating factor for me for Nikola Jokic. This is why I think he's the MVP. If you put any of these other four players in place of Nikola Jokic on this Denver roster, Embiid, Giannis, Morant, DeRozan, I don't think any of them are able to do what Jokic has done with this exact roster in the same way. And what I mean by that is his skill set is so unique and it's so valuable that it can individually raise the play of all these other guys on the floor to the point where Denver is consistently winning games that they have no business winning, because he's such an incredible passer and such an incredible team connector. And he can space the floor if you need him to. He can dominate in the post if you need him to. He can be a point guard if you need him to. Anything that you need out of an individual matchup offensively out of Nikola Jokic, he can do for you. And as special as Embiid and Giannis and Morant and DeRozan have been this year, I don't think that's the case with all of them. I think the two guys that come closest are Giannis and Embiid, but Giannis still needs a significant amount of spacing around him despite some growth he's made with his three-point shot, with his jumper. Jokic is better in that aspect, and Embiid can shoot from the perimeter as well, but he's not on the same level as a passer as Jokic is. And I don't think that there's anyone else that checks the boxes the way that Jokic does from a skill set standpoint, from a narrative standpoint, from top to bottom. I don't think you can argue against him as an MVP. And I think if you were going to try to, a lot of people were going to jump to this idea of the two-way impact of Jokic and the fact that Embiid and Giannis, those guys are significantly better defenders. I think that's the conversation right now, is those three guys, and the thing that closes the gap between Jokic and then Embiid and Giannis is the fact that those guys are significantly better defenders. And you're correct, they are definitely better, but the gap is not as wide as it was 3 years ago. Jokic used to be disgustingly bad defensively. He's not as bad anymore. He's like average to, at times, above average. And I think that the difference that you can make offensively matters so much more than the difference that you can make defensively, not to mention the fact that if Giannis is supposed to be such an incredible individual defender, the Bucks have not been a good defensive team in the new year, in 2022, and Philly's been fine. So I think that's really where the argument comes down to, is like, do you think that Jokic should win the MVP, or do you think that Embiid should? And when you're making that argument, I'm curious, how do you differentiate Embiid from Jokic? I just laid out the case as to how you differentiate Jokic from Embiid because of his individual skill set and how perfectly he's able to lift up a group around him that he really has no business doing, and the fact that their record is significantly better than it should be. And I think that is such a more impressive accomplishment. Because yes, Embiid's been missing Simmons, but he still got Tobias Harris, who's better than anybody offensively, at least on Denver. He still got Tyrese Maxey, who's better than anybody offensively on Denver. And Aaron Gordon's a good player, but I don't think it's honestly close between the two rosters. And Jokic has been incredibly available. He's been awesome when he's been on the floor, and their records are not different. If Philadelphia was far and away the one seed in the East and they were on pace to win 60 games, I think this would be Embiid's award. I really, really do, because Jokic would start to kind of fall into that category of like when Russ won the MVP averaging a triple-double. And at a certain point, there's just too big of a difference in the standings for you to be the most valuable guy in the league and your team not be one of the better records in the league. Typically, that's been kind of a check mark that you need to have, is you need to have one of the better records in the league. But I think specifically in a season like this, where everything has been so weird, where there's protocol guys missing in the beginning of the year, there's a bit, I feel like, been more injuries than normal. Ben Simmons just sitting out, Jokic missing his two best guys. When the records are basically the same and everything else is such a huge positive in Jokic's direction, I think it has to be him. Now I'm open to other conversations, other discussions, other arguments against this, but that's where I'm at.